Hello.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Oh, welcome to NiCHE Conversations.
Thank you.
This is our sixth episode of season 3, and I'm Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Dillon Maxwell. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Dillon Maxwell. I'm a historian in Colorado. I work for Colorado State University at the Center for Environmental Management of Military Land. So I do a lot of federal compliance work. I'm authoring some administrative histories of a few National Park Service sites. So I still get to have that nice tie to, recreational public lands,
Yeah,
not purely military, which is a little bit outside my bag. But
excellent.
and yeah, I worked for the Forest Service for a season and had definitely a different experience than I thought I was going to have because of the fire.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to get getting into today. Earlier this fall, Micah Jorgensen, one of our
Mhm.
editors, edited a 12-part series called Fire Stories. And your piece, A Fire Archive in the Making, Working the 2020 Cameron Peak Fire, was a part of this series. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So you've touched upon it, but I wanted to, start this off by, how was a historian working in and during this fire, which is the largest wildfire in Colorado history? Is that correct?
Yes, it was the largest wildfire in Colorado history. Um, so the pandemic was largely to blame for this one. So I had finished my master's in history at Colorado State in 2019,
Mm-hmm.
and I was working on a couple small projects with the Public Lands History Center, who I'm still kind of uh, affiliated with through the admin histories. But I was an hourly employee of the university, and they have a 9-month rule if you're an hourly, so you can only work 9 months, and then your term is up for 3 months. And they were working on getting me a full-time research associate position, and the pandemic happened, and they were like, well, we're halting a lot of contracts and we can't travel, and since we get contracted out and travel to go survey and go to archives, they were like,
Mm-hmm.
we'll see what happens. We'll
Yeah,
call you back in the fall. And part
yeah.
of getting out of grad school, I applied for a million different jobs,
Mm-hmm.
and I applied for a couple just seasonal Forest Service jobs, I think in September of 2019, and the pandemic hit. And I got an email from the office in Fort Collins, and they were like, oh, we reviewed your application, and if you want to be a seasonal, we'd love to have you. And I
Yeah.
was like, well, great. My previous career was in landscaping and outdoor services. So I was like, I'd love to go outside again. And you know.
Yeah.
Um, so over that interim break between being an hourly and coming on full time at Colorado State, it was a nice way to pay the bills and go outside.
Yeah.
And the added layer of the pandemic kind of put some pressure on, me being like, no, I need to take this job because I need
Yeah.
to pay my rent and I don't know what's going to happen. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it was just a lot of kind of good luck circumstance that I worked an hourly Forest Service seasonal position with a master's, which
Yeah.
I look back and I'm like, I would totally do it again in a heartbeat. It
Yeah.
gave me such good perspective on things. So,
That's
yeah, that's
awesome.
kind of how I ended up in that, and then ended that job and came back to CSU, and I'm still here.
Cool. I love that. Like, I have a PhD, but I would totally, I left like traditional academia and I would totally do like a seasonal. I'm a park historian, and the
Hmm.
idea of actually, like, sometimes I just get so frustrated. I'm like, I'm just sitting at my desk thinking about the outdoors and writing about it. And I never get to actually experience it anymore. And sometimes I just get like, what have I done? What have
I know, it's like anytime my field season starts up and they're like, oh, you're gonna go to this place and this place, I'm like, oh, this is making the 9 months of desk work worth it.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
it does get hard
Um,
when you're just reading about the outdoors and writing about it every day, and you're like, oh, I wish I could actually go outside.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. Um, so in the post, you're kind
Mhm.
of, talking about your perspective as a historian experiencing working during this fire for the Forest Service. And I thought we could talk about how you saw history employed during this fire and also like what you mean by like a fire archive.
Mhm. So I think the biggest way I saw history employed was all of the fire crews, the fire management folks, who were kind of running all the logistics and trying to track where the fire was going to go next. Um, a lot of these folks would, talk about, well, the High Park fire, which happened in 2012, they'd bring that up a lot. They're like, well, I don't think it's going to go past this because, we look at all these historic burns and we can kind of figure out where things are going.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about a lot of, I guess, past management that would either, say, well, we hadn't clear cut or thinned any of this out in 20, 30 years. So this is probably where it's going to go next.
Yeah.
And so just that history of land management, even though it was much more recent, was pretty present. The media, a lot, I'd turn on public radio in the morning when I would drive up there and they'd say, oh, this is starting to be the most historic fire event in
Mm-hmm.
Colorado. And they'd reference a lot of other older fires. So there was kind of that subtle historic um, thread through all of it.
Yeah.
Um, but the second part of your question about the fire archive in the making, it was like every day there would just be, a new forest fire order, a new closure, just so many documents created. I was
Mm-hmm.
making, my daily reports about all the contacts I had or what I saw when I was out in the field. And it was just kind of this like huge mound of paperwork that would pile up. And, as a historian, I was like, oh, these are all the things someone, 50 years from now is going to use. And then
Mm-hmm.
also just the news coverage. I think they had like a Facebook Live fire update every day. I mean, there was just so much generated from this fire, and watching it all just kind of pile up was kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. I always like that idea of sitting back and kind of thinking, in 40 years, how are we going to be, what sources are there going to be for this certain thing and how are they going to be interpreted? And I like how you're mentioning like the Facebook Lives and stuff. And it's like, are those going to be available in an archive somewhere? Are they going to disappear at some point?
Hmm.
Is this conversation going to disappear at some point? Yeah, and like kind of. Mm, I liked at one point in the essay you talk about like our connection to the past kind of weakening through
Hmm.
the fire, but then also kind of like this idea of creating this archive is almost like a strengthening our connection to the future as well. Like there's like
Hmm.
this kind of interesting linear versus kind of circular idea of time going on in your
Hmm.
essay that I really enjoyed. Um, and yeah, I like the idea of weakening, like kind of like our like anthropocentric idea of the landscape, right? Like the way that we connect value to a landscape can be really, put into turmoil by a fire or another similar disaster.
Yeah, and that was I'm glad you brought that up. That was one thing I thought was so interesting. It was they'd say, "Oh, you need to go make sure there's no one, trying to get into the fire break to camp on,
Yeah.
road 318." And so I'd truck up there, and I was like, "Well, if someone could get back to this road, they probably know some fire safety." But I'd come across, homestead remnants or there was a lot of herding up there, and so there'd be,
Mm-hmm.
like little like herder cabins, and there was just all these like little cultural resources, and it's like, oh well, if the fire gets there, that's just going to be gone.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was that kind of like anthropocentric tie to the past.
Yeah.
But then you think about, it's like, okay, well, the Forest Service was managing out all of these historic fires that would have happened, and this is kind of more of the natural process, and
Mm-hmm.
these are the consequences of halting a lot of that stuff. So it was kind of this interesting, like, what there's so much going on with this. But yeah, that was, and I think for me, what I do now with a lot of historic preservation and cultural resource compliance work, I'd drive by some, trash scatter or something out there, and I'd be like, oh, that's gonna burn, and then no one's ever gonna know that there was, a pile of cans and an old, car
Yeah.
radiator out here in the forest. But then I think about it, I'm like, no, it's probably it's okay if we lose that little connection to the past of, I guess, someone littering in the 1920s.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Um, and that used to be very prevalent where I grew up outside of a state park. I had like my favorite old dumps in the woods because that's what people used to do before there was like centralized garbage pickup, particularly in rural areas. You just throw it in the woods, right? You have
Yeah.
a pile. And so, anyways, that's an aside that I
Hmm.
enjoyed. I enjoyed in your because I just felt a connection to that because there's like 2 or 3 dumps in the woods where I grew up that I would visit and like find what bottles I could find and whatnot. Um, Anyways, but you touched upon it a little bit, but I wanted to, you're not working for the fire service anymore. You're
Hmm.
not on the land all the time anymore. But what did you take away from this experience that you are using in your life as a historian?
So I think the most like uh, first and foremost things from that is I am working on 2 administrative histories of 2 national park units, and actually working as well. I was a recreation tech too for the Forest Service, which is my official title. So I was dealing with recreators, recreational sites, and since the Park Service is so much more of, I guess, like recreation use public land, authoring some of these administrative histories, having that experience working for a public land management agency with recreators. I'm writing these sections in these admin histories where it's like, oh, I can actually see, this rec plan that they developed in 1960. I can see, how that would impact someone working on the ground instead of just reading the report and thinking like, well, I guess, you know, I guess this is just what they were thinking, and maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, but actually
Mhm.
having boots on the ground. And Micah Jorgensen brought up a good point when we were drafting this. She was like, oh, it's like, Richard White's knowing nature through labor. It's like knowing public land management through labor, or actually managing, a small part of public land. Um, so I think that has definitely given me a lot more insight and perspective into, coming across these Park Service reports that was like, well, we tried this, but it didn't work. And,
Mhm.
thinking back to being in a, uniform and going, I'm like, well, that, of course that didn't work because we tried that too. And, people didn't respond well to it. So yeah, just that knowing nature through labor, knowing public lands through labor was invaluable.
Cool. Yeah, I love this. I love this story, and I love how like it wasn't a planned thing, but the pandemic just kind of made it happen, and now it's like a really valuable part of your past, and that's um, yeah. I don't want to be like, oh, the pandemic was good, but sometimes the hiccups in the road are like lead to really interesting things. So,
Oh
yeah.
yeah. And I mean, the whole, from the fire, being a part of working on something like that, again, it was like, yeah, this is such a neat thing that I was a part of, but it was also, I have to recognize it was such a devastating event for, so many of the folks that lived up there, and wildlife. So yeah, it's kind of a complex thing, especially with that added context of the pandemic going on, and
Mhm.
the boom in public recreation because of that, where everyone's just like, yeah, just you have to go outside to have fun. And definitely made it a lot more stressful for our job, because it was like, oh, more people outside means more people are going to start fires. And
Mhm.
yeah, there we were, Cameron Peak, there's big one.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just kind of a reminder of like, yeah, the 2020 fire season. I remember being it was just another thing added on to that year of
Hmm.
just kind of, general, ugh. And maybe we've gotten used to it at this point or something. I don't know, but I'm not feeling it quite as much. I don't know. Just
Hmm.
nihilism is set in or something. I don't know. But Yeah, it's just interesting to talk about. Well, this is a great conversation. I want to
Yeah.
thank you for joining me today, Dylan. This was
Yeah.
wonderful.
Thanks for having me. It was fun. It was fun writing the piece, but it was also nice to be able to. I think sometimes I'm much better at talking than
mm,
I am writing. So I was
yeah,
appreciative that y'all set this up.
yeah. It's interesting that some people feel that way, and some people are terrified of this. But
Hmm.
I do find that it brings out different aspects of the pieces, and that's why I like doing it. Is that it just kind of enriches what was already written and stuff. So, and
Hmm.
yeah, it's great to talk to you. So,
Yeah, likewise.
yeah, take care, Dylan. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.